The podcast is Going to the Conspiracy, featuring Auckland's Josh Addison and Bucharest's Dr. Matthew R. X. Dentith.
Hello, you're listening to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. My name's Josh Addison. I'm sitting here in Auckland, New Zealand, and all the way across on the other side of the world in Bucharest, Romania, not Budapest, as I managed to say last time when having a mild medical event, I assume. It's Dr. Matthew R. X. Dentith.
Good evening, or morning, or afternoon, or late night, depending on when you're listening to this episode. But importantly, good evening, as Alfred Hitchcock would presumably have said if he was part of this podcast.
But he's dead. Which, frankly, I find one of his larger character flaws, to be honest.
It's true. I actually think that's actually had a deleterious effect upon his directing career of recent years. I mean, that straight-to-DVD thriller he did 2 years ago, if he'd been alive and directing that, it would have been a very different film. And would have existed.
Yes, exactly. We've had another mild hiatus, I suppose, in between this episode and the last. Last time we were 2 weeks in between episodes because Matthew was off being an international man of mystery, gadding about Europe. This time it's because I was sick. Quite frankly, that's all it was. It's sort of winter in New Zealand. It's kind of that season where people are being sick all over the place, and it was just my turn. And so
it's because we have a roster system in Aotearoa, New Zealand, for when people get ill. I've actually got 3 weeks of illness accruing back home that I've got to take care of, because as a citizen of the country, I must do my I must foul my words and say weird things. I must do my duty.
You certainly must. Yes. No, everyone around me at my place of work seemed to be getting sick, and then most of my family was getting sick. I was starting to feel like sort of the guy in the zombie movie who's the last uninfected one, and it's just a matter of time, because it's one of those zombie movies where everyone dies in the end, not the other kind of zombie movie where a few survivors get away to appear in the sequel, if you know what I mean.
I do, and I think our listeners know as well.
Exactly. So enough excuses. Maybe we should make up for lost time by flying like madmen straight into the news section.
Yes, let us crash into the sun of news.
Oh. Is that sirens in the background? Are they coming for you, Matthew?
Yep, they heard about our news segment, and they're not coming to get me, they're coming to join in.
Ooh la la.
Of course, it's going to turn out that those sirens actually don't appear on the recording. And
I heard them at my end, so...
The section will be deleted or only appear in the video segment. At which point, I hope you do some special effects to make red and blue light start shining to one side, and then a cartoon police officer comes in, shackles me, and drags me away, and I scream, "No, don't take me away!" Well, for some reason, I burst into a medley of Bette Midler songs. Because
you do appear to be wearing a sort of black and white striped top there, so you're already dressed like a convict.
Well, I am living in Romania.
What?
Precisely. Should we go on to the news?
Yeah, let's go on to the news, yes.
Breaking conspiracy theories in the news.
Right, well, let's not beat about the bush. Matthew, you have an announcement, do you? Some sort of academical publicatory nonsense going on in your near future.
Indeed. I have a forthcoming article in the journal Synthase, one of the top philosophy journals, called Conspiracy Theories on the Basis of the Evidence. I've just seen the proofs. Turns out that due to a lack of Unicode support on Springer's part, Springer's being the ultimate publisher of Synthase, I've had to go through and reinstate a whole bunch of apostrophes in my article, but the article in theory will be available online within about a week, so we'll be able to talk about it in more detail next week after Josh has had a chance to read it. You are going to read it, Joshua, aren't you? You are going to read the article.
It's not going to be behind a paywall or anything like that?
It probably will be behind a paywall, but I'm fairly sure I can give you a preprint draft, which will be fairly close to the final version for you to pass your eyes upon. That made no sense as a sentence, but I'm sticking by it. You'll be passing your eyes upon it.
I certainly will. Yep, no, I can do that. I swear it will be done. So then, Do you wish to bask in your academic glory for a little longer?
I
or
think
shall
we'll save that for next week. Let me
Okay.
bask next week.
Right, well then let's talk about NASA and sea levels. Has NASA been saying stuff about sea levels?
So there's been a report going around on particular parts of the internet that NASA has finally admitted that sea levels are not rising, but rather than falling, and the media is failing to report upon it. And indeed, if you go and look at the data that these particular sites are citing, then you do discover that in 2015 to 2016, there has been a net decrease in sea levels across the globe. But as people who have looked into the wider data trend have pointed out, if you're only looking at 2 years in, say, the geological record, you can find all sorts of things which are out of kink with normal trends. And if you look at a 10-year, 20-year, or 50-year data set, you'll find that the 2 years of sea level dip that we saw in 2015 and 2016 stands against the massive rise in sea levels generally across a 10 to 25 to 50-year time period. So yes, it is true that for 2 years sea levels did fall, but that is not evidence of a general trend of sea levels falling, and the reason why NASA and news sites aren't trumpeting this fact to the world is the fact that they recognize that a 2 year blip doesn't actually tell us anything about general trends. So there's no conspiracy to cover this up, it's just the way the cookie crumbles.
So essentially, the people who are making these claims are doing the exact same thing as Disco Stu on The Simpsons when he said from 1970 to 1974 disco sales increased 200%. If these trends continue, which was a theory. Maybe I'll find the clip and just splice that in instead of my own feeble impression.
Did you know that disco record sales were up 400% for the year ending 1976? If these trends continue,
But that's
And
what they're
also,
doing anyway, isn't it?
Disco Stu does not need to advertise.
No, he doesn't. There's no reason I should be singing his praises at all. He can do it himself. Now Nibiru, Matthew Nibiru. Is that the eclipse is just going to be over the States, isn't it? Will you see any effect in Romania?
So I did try to find that out, and no, really it is only going to be across the continental United States that the eclipse is going to be a big issue.
Yeah, I hear in the morning here that there might be a slight sort of reddish cast across part of the moon or something, but certainly nothing in the way of a proper eclipse. But anyway, the eclipse obviously is a harbinger of doom to a great many people. Apparently Bonnie Tyler is going to put on a concert and sing Total Eclipse of the Heart in the middle of the total eclipse, which would be quite spectacular.
Because if I had the money, I would definitely go to that concert.
But not nearly as spectacular, of course, as the Earth's imminent destruction when the planet Nibiru crashes into us on September the 23rd, it says here. We've talked about Nibiru in the past, this bizarre rogue planet that supposedly is going to come hurtling through the solar system and crash into Earth and destroy us all at various dates, which always turn out to not be accurate. And then the people say, oh, okay, actually, I mean, it's a little bit later, oh, a little bit later, a little bit later. But the current date, apparently, is September the 23rd, and those damn party poopers NASA have been at it again and say, well, no, obviously that's not true. If there were anything the size of a planet anywhere close to us, we would know about that. Yes, maybe we miss the odd asteroids from time to time, but something planet-sized, we'd definitely be aware of that if it were only a month out from hitting us.
Now, I must admit, my suspicion is that this is a National Party plot to stop the Labour Party, New Zealand First and the Greens from taking over the New Zealand Parliament on the election on the 27th of September. It would be quite convenient for Nationals polling if in fact the Earth was wiped out on the 23rd and the election was not held.
Yes, you never know. Or even if they just convinced us all to flee to our underground bunkers, trying to ride out the destruction of the planet, and therefore can't make it to the polls.
And given that National Party voters don't believe in such things as climate change or planets bumping into other planets, they'd be the one group of people who wouldn't go to the bunkers. and thus are more likely to vote. Although conversely, National Party voters are people more likely to have bunkers and ipso facto not use them. So it's very, very confusing. I actually don't think Bill English has thought this plot through.
No, and perhaps we shouldn't be going too far into ideas about people trying to unduly influence the results of elections, since that's basically going to be our theme for the episode. So maybe we should hang back now and instead talk about dead celebrities. There's been a few lately, and where there are dead celebrities, there are conspiracy theories that those celebrities were murdered. Would that be a fair thing to say?
That would be a fair thing to say. So people will be aware that last year was a very bad year for celebrity deaths, although actually it turns out last year was not a bad year for celebrity deaths. On average, the same number of celebrities died last year as it did the year before, and the year before that. It just turns out there were celebrities of a particular age.
Yes.
Yeah. This year we've had both Chris Cornell and Chester Bennington having died. Both having died in what are suspicious circumstances. So Chris Cornell was drug overdose, Chester Bennington was suicide. People have been suspicious about their deaths, so people have claimed that Chester Bennington wasn't going to commit suicide and must have been murdered, and Chris Cornell was off the drugs, so it must have been a lethal injection of some kind. The families of Cornell and Bennington, by and large, have told these people to shut up, but there are a number of conspiracy theories going around, one of which unites both Cornell and Bennington, because it turns out our old friends, the Global Pedophile Network, were about to be outed by Chris Cornell, who was using his considerable wealth to uncover said pedophiles in our influential institutions and the government, allegedly. And he had told Chester Bennington about his plan. So when Cornell died suspiciously, Bennington became worried that his life was also at stake, and lo and behold, Bennington is now dead. So the conspiracy theory goes they were killed by pedophiles.
Not super convincing. I think if you really wanted to look for a proper motive, certainly in the case of Chester Bennington, it would be the person with the second whitest name in the world was tired of being in the number 2 slot and bumped off Chester Bennington, the man with the whitest name in the world, so that he could claim the top spot. So if we could figure out who that person is, I think they would be our prime suspect, quite frankly.
And if you know who the top person with the whitest name in the world, why not send an email in to the podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy? Contact details at the end of the episode.
Ironically, as pointed out by 30 Rock, one of the most white men with the whitest names in the world is actually Wesley Snipes.
Oh, good point, and well made.
Anyway, not my joke, unfortunately. I'd love to take credit, but I'm not on the level of the writers of 30 Rock. Now that we've kind of divided the news into sections this week, as they've just
divided the news into sections.
I like to categorise, Matthew. It's what I am. So that was essentially the MISC or other section. But now we move into the Trump section. He hasn't done anything particularly noteworthy over the last couple of days, I assume. So let's look over
apart from failing to denounce
Shut up!
racism.
He's done nothing over the past couple of days. The world has been perfectly fine, and everything's functioning as normal. As I was saying...
I don't want to live in your normal world.
Yes. What, denial? It's lovely. But putting aside the recent developments, which I don't think have been overly conspiratorial unless you start getting into all manner of things to do with America's troubled past and racism and civil wars and so on and so forth, which there's probably a whole episode in, but it's not this episode. We've had a few other things that launching his own news network thingy. Not super conspiratorial, but
Trump has Trump TV now, which is hosted by a former CNN news host, I believe. And basically, it looks like the kind of state broadcast you'd expect from a third world nation, where El Presidente, and that's a fairly racist way to assume that the third world nations are
Latin American.
Spanish, Latin American or Spanish colonies, is doing great and everything is fine. But it it kind of feels A, creepy, B, authoritarian, which probably explains A, why it feels creepy, and C, it kind of feels like it's the very fake news that Trump keeps lashing out against, and that now he's producing his own fake news to compete with the fake news he claims is being produced by other people. It all just seems fairly wishy-washy and quietly indicative of the kind of person that Trump is, always in need of being boosted, even though he is technically the most powerful person in the world.
Moving on to the Seth Rich story, which we've talked about a couple of times. So where are we at now? Why is it still going, for starters?
Well, actually, what's interesting about this is the allegations of the White House and Fox News working together in the US to press the idea that the DNC hack and the death of Seth Rich were connected, actually might be, I should say, stymieing Rupert Murdoch and the Murdoch family business from buying Sky TV in the UK, because UK administrators are going, there appears to be collusion between a theoretically independent news team and the American government, and that's not the kind of thing we want in our tightly regulated media environment in the UK. So yes, the fact that Sean Hannity continues to talk about Seth Rich actually might stop Rupert Murdoch from buying another TV station in the UK, and that's a fairly interesting consequence to the story.
Somewhat bizarre, really. Now, I just basically read a one-sentence précis of a thing earlier today, which perhaps you've heard of. There was some group came out and claimed that they could show that the DNC email hacks were an internal leak and not a foreign hack. Have you heard this? I've seen no details about it yet. I'll need to hunt it down properly for next episode. I was wondering if you had seen a similar thing
about this for a while. So certain news outlets, particularly those who have been claiming that the Russiagate investigation is pointless. And this is actually a point which has been made not just by right-wing news outlets, but certain left-wing news outlets as well, have been claiming that there are certain intelligence experts in the US who claim that the DNC hack was undertaken in such a way there had to be someone on the ground on the continental US for the hack to have worked, and it couldn't have been people in Russia. So there's no IP trail that goes back to Russia. There's only a local hack. Now, like you, I've heard these stories. I haven't read into it in any particular depth. We should probably report on this next week. But yes, there are stories going around that there is evidence the DNC hack had to be local. Many of these people are also still pressing the convenient death of Seth Rich. So it also ties back to the story once again. People claiming that, Seth Rich was working for the DNC, then there was a DNC hack, and now he's dead. So, yeah, the story continues. The story continues.
Watch this space. And more fake news, which turned out to not be fake news after the release of those transcripts of Trump's calls with old Turnbull and who's the president of Mexico? Peña.
Ferrante? Did you just say Peña?
No, I said Peña.
Oh, that's much better.
Is that his first name or last name? No. Well, you don't know. Maybe Enya is the president of Mexico now. She has to be doing something. She's not singing. Orinoco Flow's not on the charts anymore. That's
true, and there's no Lord of the Rings films for her to do songs for.
So President of Mexico, I think, would be the next logical step.
Fair enough. So President Enya and Malcolm Turnbull, Prime Minister of Australia.
Yes. So yeah, I mean, what It's essentially a case of a cry of fake news has been demonstrated as being not that fake after all. I
Yeah,
guess.
so people who may not be aware of what happened, particularly with the Australian PM, Malcolm Turnbull had a conversation with Donald Trump shortly after his inauguration. There was a leak in the Australian media that that phone call, A, went very badly, and Trump terminated the call early. Donald Trump then said no, that was fake news, and it was a very pleasant call, and there were good relationships between Australia and the US. And now we have a leaked transcript of the call between Donald Trump and Malcolm Turnbull, and it turns out to be a very terse conversation, and indeed, Donald Trump terminates the call, and not just terminates the call early, claims that it was much more pleasant talking to Vladimir Putin as he hangs up.
What a
So
nice
Trump
fellow.
claimed this was fake news, and it turned out not to be fake news. The other interesting part, so the conversation he had with the president of Mexico, who apparently we now consider to be Enya, Trump asked the president of Mexico, Enya, not to talk about the border wall Trump wants to build because it's not important. Which kind of indicates that even though Trump keeps going on about we've got to build this wall, we've got to build this wall, actually in private, he doesn't care about the wall at all.
Well, or he knows it's never going to happen and is hoping maybe people will just forget about it, perhaps, if no one else brings it up, such as Enya, the president of Mexico.
Now, I should point out that you were right to say Pena, but also the URL for this misspells Malcolm. It's Malculm. Malcolm Turnbull. Yeah.
Well, we've started talking about Australia, so shall we segue seamlessly into the more local Australasian-related conspiracy theory news?
Indeed.
So
Indeed.
what's been going on with our Auditor General?
Right, so we had a new Auditor General appointed who got voted through the House, and so everything looked fine. And then it turned out that the new Auditor General, Martin Matthews, in his previous departmental work, had basically ignored claims of large-scale fraud going on in his department. And not just ignored claims of wide-scale fraud, actually talked to the fraudster after the accusations were made, telling the fraudster about the accusations and who made the accusations, which then led to the fraudster basically pushing those people out of work. And Martin Matthews, when this was revealed, was going, well, yes, mistakes are made, but, I was taken in as well. This led to the opposition parties going, actually, we don't have any confidence in this person being the Auditor General. The government of the day, the National Party, went, well, we're still standing by this person. They were voted through properly. You endorsed him. You can't take that endorsement away. It was then decided that there should be an inquiry into the conduct to see whether basically he should have acted better. Before that inquiry was released, Martin Matthews resigned, but also asked that the contents of that inquiry be kept under wraps, which the government has agreed to. And so now we have an inquiry which may have shown the Auditor General knew more than he claimed, or could have done more than he did, and we can't know about it. And that's kind of fishy. That kind of thing should be available for the public to see, because we actually need to see what kind of mechanisms are in place or what changes need to be made. But because this report is being kept secret, those changes may not occur or may not be made at all.
Yes, and speaking of dodgy things being kept secret, more to the saga of Citizen Teal, Peter Thiel. I ask this every week. What site was he? Was he PayPal?
Yeah, PayPal.
He was PayPal. Yep. So
in charge of Palantir.
Trump supporting, or at least right-leaning American millionaire, who it turns out is a secret New Zealand citizen. And there's been, we've talked about this a couple of times in the past, there's been a fair amount of dodginess as to how he actually managed to obtain citizenship in the first place, given that he appears to have spent hardly any time here at all, ever.
6 days. Six days.
Yeah, not 6 non-continuous days. And yeah, basically it appears very much like the criteria that saw him awarded citizenship was that he has lots of money, has given some of it to charity, and could give some more of it, invest more of it in the local economy. So it seemed very much as though sort of, rich person buying New Zealand citizenship, which isn't how things are supposed to be. Now it's turned out that records involving his citizenship application have been redacted in some cases at the request of Mr. Teal, or at least of his legal team. So there are at least emails I've seen that have been almost completely redacted. And again, it's a case of, so now before it was a case of, hang on, what's gone on here? People just didn't know about this and had gone and investigated. Now people, having investigated, have found that certain information has actually been hidden again and again. It's been done at the request of I'd like to say foreigner, but he kind of isn't now because he's a New Zealand citizen. But
he's a citizen.
But
He's one of us, Joshua.
Person who's a majority
podcast right now.
A majority resident has had allowances made for him purely, again, it seems, because he is kind of rich and important.
Yes, all very suspicious. And the fact the government obliged the request is suspicious itself. Now, this information has now been released because a complaint was lodged with the Ombudsman about this redaction, and the Ombudsman has ruled that actually this information is in the public interest, so it is now out there for the world to see. But the fact that the request was obliged in the first place is kind of weird.
But now that he's in New Zealand,
that's not how things work back home.
Well, one would hope so. But at least now that he's a New Zealand citizen, Peter Teal can no longer become a member of the Australian Parliament. It turns out, well, he probably couldn't have because he was an American citizen. But anyway, there's this whole schmozzle, which I think is an Antipodean term entirely. But there's a to-do, a hoopla,
a farrango,
all sorts of stuff going on in Australia. Over their Deputy Prime Minister and some other MPs as well, I think, because it turns out there's this...
so 2 Green senators as well.
Senators, there we go. Yeah, I forget Australia has a Senate. They have states and everything. So it turns out that in the Australian Constitution, there's a part that essentially says... Actually, I forget the specific wording. It has something to do with allegiance to foreign powers or something. But one of the things it implies is if you have dual citizenship, Australian citizenship and something else, that disqualifies you from being a high-ranking government person, such as the Deputy Prime Minister. And it's come around to sort of bite a few people when it turns out that the current Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Barnaby Joyce, who now that I think about it, possibly he could... that's exactly where I was going, yes. Maybe we need to start investigating Barnaby Joyce over the death of Chester Bennington. But that issue aside, this man, who was born in Australia, and as far as he knew was an Australian citizen through and through, turns out because his father is a New Zealander, that means he is also entitled to New Zealand citizenship. And so it's been brought up.
That at a particular point in time, the children of New Zealand citizens born abroad were de facto New Zealand citizens. So the law's been changed subsequently. But Barnaby Joyce was born at a period of time where if your parent was a New Zealander, you automatically got New Zealand citizenship no matter where you were born.
Yes, and I've heard, I don't know if this is true or not, I've heard in the past that New Zealand citizenship can't be renounced, or at least, you can say, I renounce my New Zealand citizenship, and New Zealand will say, yeah, whatever. And if you were to then later come back and say, actually, can I unrenounce my citizenship? We'll say, yeah, whatever. We gave it to you before. Yeah. But so there's been a few people caught out by this who were born in Australia and who, as far as they were aware, were only Australian citizens, turn out to have dual citizenship. I don't know if is there anything overly conspiratorial about it? There's been a few people. There's the whole Chris Hipkins thing, wasn't there? Because he sort of asked a few pointed questions. This is a New Zealand politician, asked a few pointed questions in the House about exactly how New Zealand citizenship works, which threw another log on the fire, as it were. But is it actually conspiratorial, or is it just a bit funny?
So it is a bit funny. Some people have said it is a little bit conspiratorial because when the Department of Immigration were asked about Joyce's particular status, they gave a ruling saying, well, his father is a New Zealand citizenship. So his father is a New Zealand citizenship. That's even different from being a New Zealand citizen. He's not just a New Zealand citizenship, a boat that floats and has citizen rights. He's also a New Zealand citizen. Actually, I think his father's dead, so he was a New Zealand citizen. Talking about boats has mean I've completely lost my chain of thought. All right, so basically the story goes, the Department of Immigration was asked, is Barnaby Joyce a New Zealand citizen? And they went, yes, because of his father. Now, some people are saying, oh, they probably should have informed the Australian Parliament at that particular point in time. Isn't that a bit suspicious? Is the Department of Immigration trying to support the Australian government? But other people have gone, well, no, there's nothing suspicious about this at all. They were asked for the status of a private citizen and what their citizenship is. The Department of Immigration is not obliged, and indeed not allowed to, then go to other countries and go, are you aware you have a New Zealand citizen there? That is a private matter for private individuals. So yes, on one level it's kind of strange because it might affect the majority in the Australian Parliament. The Australian Parliament currently has a government with a majority of one, so if Barnaby Joyce has to renounce his position as MP because of his dual citizen nature, then they have to go to a fresh election. But there's nothing suspicious about the fact the Department of Immigration never talked to Australia about this, because the Australian government never asked information about Barnaby Joyce's citizenship, and Barnaby Joyce never asked for information about his citizenship. No conspiracy there. The more realistic conspiracy might be that members of the Australian Labor Party have been fishing for cases where Australian government MPs might have a dual citizenship nature, and that they might be then trying to farm that Labour out into the Labour Party in New Zealand. But the Department of Labour, Labour's been used a lot here. Labour Party in Australia, Labour in New Zealand, the Department of Labour, which is completely unrelated to the Labour Party. But the fact that the Department of Labour never did anything or said anything to the Australians is actually not cause for alarm, nor evidence of a New Zealand conspiracy to support the government in Australia at this time.
Well, that's a shame. And now I see finally a note, which I believe you put there, saying something Paula Bennett. Would you care to elaborate?
Well, it is vague for the sheer fact that I've yet to get to the bottom of this. So on Twitter, every so often a story comes out that there's a proto-investigation into Paula Bennett and benefit fraud. So as I think
Paula Bennett being our own Deputy Prime Minister currently.
Yeah. Now, I think did we discuss the Materia Ture thing? I actually don't think we did. It kind of occurred during the break.
We mentioned it at the end of last episode, I think, just as a general chat.
There was an issue in Aotearoa recently where the former co-leader of the Green Party admitted to historic benefit fraud, and then used that as a platform for saying that when her party was in government, they would be reforming the welfare system to make sure that people wouldn't have to defraud the benefit system in order to feed their children. Now, at the time, the National Party, the governing party of Aotearoa, New Zealand, at this particular point in time, basically didn't do much to attack Materia Ture because the current Deputy Prime Minister also was on welfare with a child earlier in her life. Now, some people said the reason why the National Party didn't attack Ture on this issue is that Paula Bennett, even though she disapproved of benefit fraud, was sympathetic to what it's like to be on a benefit at that time and wasn't going to attack a fellow mother who was trying to raise a baby at that particular point in time. The other side of the coin is that the reason why the National Party didn't say anything is that they have evidence that Paula Bennett did something similar at the time, and they don't want the spotlight being shone upon the Deputy Prime Minister, because something which brought down the downfall of the co-leader of the Greens would also have drastic effect on the National Party, and it would be worse because it really would cut into the kind of base the National Party has. National Party voters, by and large, don't like welfare recipients, and they particularly don't like people who commit welfare fraud. So apparently there's an attempt to get evidence to the police that Paula Bennett has engaged in welfare fraud, and apparently, I have to use the word apparently here because there's very little in the way of evidence or a paper trail, just random tweets that appear in my timeline. The police have told the people trying to lodge this information they need to talk to the Minister of Police about this, and the Minister of Police happens to be Paula Bennett. So there might well be, if these tweets are to be taken seriously, evidence of a conspiracy by the government and the police to stymie an investigation into the current Deputy Prime Minister for historic welfare fraud.
Which it's kind of easy to have mixed feelings about, really, because it does seem it seems to me and other lefty hippies like myself that Muriel Ture was treated very unfairly and totally raked over the coals and has now had her political career evaporate purely because she admitted that 25 years ago, as a single mother, she indulged in some benefit fraud. And it would seem a little bit hypocritical to then say it would be a good thing for the same thing to happen to Paula Bennett. But yes, I don't know. As you say, at the moment, it's all a little bit just sort of in the realm of innuendo, I suppose. So maybe we just best wait and see.
Yes, although this is one of these situations where if nothing happens, that's going to bolster the conspiracy theory that the government and the police are hiding what Bennett did.
Well, it's just one of those conspiracy things, isn't it? Where no evidence is evidence, but that's something we're used to by now, I suppose.
Yes, and sometimes the fact no evidence is evidence is sometimes evidence of a conspiracy, and sometimes it's evidence that there's no conspiracy at all. It's very confusing.
It really is.
But you know what's really confusing, Joshua? Voting. So very confusing.
Totally
It'd be much
confusing.
easier if someone would cast votes for us, or tell us how to vote, or even better, make sure that we vote in just the right way.
Just do away with voting entirely. Yeah. Let's
just give voting to the machines. They know how to vote, and they know who to vote for. Cold, merciless logic.
Yes. Right, so we've teased you mercilessly over the last couple of episodes by saying, voter fraud, that's an interesting topic, we should talk about that properly. Well, now we're going to. Because there's been all sorts of talk lately about the most obvious one being the various claims about Russia attempting to tinker with the American election, but allegations of voter fraud and its kissing cousin voter suppression tend to pop up all the time, and they tend to be fairly conspiratorial in nature. Voter fraud obviously is illegal. So if you're going to do it, then you'll probably be conspiring to do so, because you don't want to talk about your illegal activities out in the open. How do we want to cover this?
And voter suppression is obviously quite conspiratorial, because coming up with a plan to suppress particular parts of the vote, you don't do that openly, or at least you don't do it openly in a way where you admit that that's your intent. You cover that up by claiming, we're just trying to stop this other issue from occurring. So yes, both voter suppression and voter fraud in the mass sense are quintessential examples of people engaging in conspiracies. The question we have is how warranted are these conspiracy theories about vote tampering and election fraud?
And
So
I guess,
I want to point out we're going to be talking an awful lot about the US here, but we're not just picking on the US. At the end of the segment, we will talk about some examples of allegations of vote tampering and election fraud elsewhere in the world. So it may look as if we're casting a very hard eye upon the Americas, but other countries engage or allegations of this kind of engagement happen as well. Ooh, the grammar in that sentence was really quite awful. Really quite awful. Well done, me. Well done, me.
Yes, so where to start? Voter fraud, I suppose. Illegal voting. Now, you mentioned we're talking about America, and I think the main claims, perhaps, of actual illegal voting, not just tampering, not just Russia hacking people's emails and trying to influence opinion and so on, but actual people casting illegal votes, has been the claim repeated by many, including President Trump, that there are these 3 million illegal votes cast in the most recent US election.
Now, it should be pointed out, this 3 million quite conveniently also covers Hillary Clinton winning the popular vote by 3 million. So the number doesn't come out of nowhere. Trump may have won the election, but he didn't win the popular vote. Clinton got 3 million more votes than Trump did. And yet it's quite convenient that Trump is going, at least 3 million illegal votes, i.e., he's trying to make the claim that Clinton didn't win the popular vote either.
And I'm pretty sure we've talked about the 3 million vote statistic as well in the past, haven't we? It was the result of one guy taking one survey and making various sort of assumptions based on the results of that survey, which was of a very small section of the immigrant population, and then extrapolating these assumptions based on sort of survey results that weren't directly related to them out into the entire immigrant community, and deciding that that implied that 3 million illegal votes had been cast, and it was highly suspect, and
it was a case of very bad statistics. It's the obvious case of lies, damn lies, and statistics. Someone took a survey and then extrapolated that survey to the total what's thought to be the total population of the US. We have to remember that the US census is not the most accurate count of people in the world. India, a much larger country, is able to have a census which is accurate within a few dozen people. The US has a census which has an error margin of millions of people. But this was a case of extrapolating from one survey to a total population and using bad math to do it.
Nevertheless, I mean, people make claims of illegal voting a fair bit, it seems. I don't know now. There was that other study, which appeared to have been much more rigorous, which made the claim, I forget the figures, but out of billions of votes cast in successive elections, they were able to find just a tiny handful of cases where a vote had very definitely been cast illegally. So in the States, at least, there appears to be more evidence that voter fraud is not a concern than against it. But as we will talk about shortly, it does happen. It happens in other countries. It happens in other countries in a fairly big way. I mean, we think of the various sort of dictatorships where they'll have a quote-unquote election where the person in charge ends up winning with 99% of the vote or something like that. We can look at examples where things are fishy, so I guess that's why people don't immediately discount these claims. But maybe we should then perhaps talk about the flip side, because people will make claims that voter fraud's a problem, therefore we need to pass laws to protect against voter fraud. People will then make the counter-conspiracy claim that this has nothing to do with voter fraud. What this really is voter suppression, and you're merely using voter fraud as a pretext to pass laws that will suppress sections of the vote that you don't like. And these, at least contemporary US examples, appear to be more warranted than the other ones.
Yes, so the US has an interesting system with respect to the way that our system works back home. So in Aotearoa, we have list votes, so you vote for a party, and you have electorate votes where you vote for your local MP. And basically, even though your local voting hall or vote meeting place, blah 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 blah, might be within a particular district or region, if you're registered to vote in Auckland Central, you can go vote at any voting booth in that electorate. Whilst the US has districting, and you have to vote within your district. And so we have this thing where the party in charge of the state gets to draw what the lines of that district look like. And this has led to what's called the gerrymandering of districts, where people draw really unusual and quite weird shapes to make sure that particular communities are stuck within particular districts, and thus they can amplify the vote of particular groups of people by making sure that you cluster, say, all the Latino vote in one district to reduce the number of votes they have in total for that particular state.
And there are, I don't know that there have been claims of gerrymandering in New Zealand, but there is the occasional controversy when electoral boundaries are shifted. Usually more around the names of them, to be honest, really. It'll be, especially in the less densely populated areas of the South Island, where they'll sort of widen an electorate which is named after a town, that's maybe up at the very north of that electorate, and then people who are miles away down south take offence at being told that they live in this area named after a town that's millions of miles away. But it should be said, though, that in New Zealand we have a population of 4 and a bit million as opposed to 300 odd million. We don't have two houses in Parliament. Things are a lot more simple here, so it would be, I suppose, a lot harder to introduce these sorts of distortions that you get with gerrymandering. Nevertheless, they do occur, and that's not all, of course, because there are other claims, such as the one I've been hearing about recently involved closing voting booths in some areas. There's stories I've read about in Georgia. The Fulton County Board of Registration and Elections was planning to close polling places in areas with a predominantly African American population, apparently. Supposedly the ACLU sued them and reversed those decisions, but those are other things that people claim are done that people won't say. Obviously, we're doing these things to try and make it harder for people who would vote against us to vote. But their opponents rather will say that, well, actually this is a conspiracy. That is exactly what they're doing. They're trying to, in a entirely legal way, stop the votes or lessen the number of votes that will be cast for their opponent.
Yes, so this is the idea that there are meant to be a certain number of voting booths in an area, kind of equidistant from one another, so it makes it easier for you to find a polling booth. By closing some of those booths down, you make it difficult for people to A, find their booth, or B, actually cast their vote. So in Aotearoa, we always ensure that we have our elections on the weekend. So the idea being that it'll be a Saturday, presumably you have the day off, so you can go down and you can vote at your leisure, and there's never a substantial queue when it comes to voting. I've never had to wait more than 5 minutes to ever cast my vote. And not only that, but because we have advance voting, you can vote 2 weeks before the election. So if it turns out you don't have Saturday off, you can go and vote the Friday before, or the Friday before that. You can organize a time to go and cast your vote. So we make it very easy to cast a vote. But if you limit the number of voting booths, and you make it difficult for people to get to those booths, or you close those booths at particular hours, you can have the effect of distorting the vote by making it difficult for certain kinds of people to be able to vote on election day.
Yes, and indeed, I mean, The electorate I live in is Maungakiekie, which is the Maori name for One Tree Hill, the biggest mountain, I think, in Auckland, which I live quite close to, and so naturally just kind of assumed I was in the centre of the Maungakiekie electorate, that it would be centred around the mountain for which it is named. So I was a little bit surprised last election to go down to the local shops and think, oh, while I'm here, I'll pop across to the primary school where they have a voting booth and do it, to be told, oh, you're not in Maungakiekie right now, this is part of the Roskilde electorate, and if you want to vote here, you'll have to cast a special vote, which you can, but it's a bit more of a fuss. And it turns out that due to the changing of electoral boundaries, my electorate has sort of extended out to the east a lot more, and so is no longer centred on it. But yeah, again, it was a case of over here, I popped into one polling booth, was got told, actually, you're not really supposed to vote here, and said, oh, okay, went home, walked 5 minutes down the street to another one. So maybe it's just us as dirty foreigners, but the idea of it being deliberately difficult to vote does just it feels a little bit bizarre to we New Zealanders.
And that brings us to voter ID laws, because that's another thing which people talk about with respect to the US. People are so afraid of the electoral fraud that some states have issued very strict voter ID laws, i.e. you have to have a particular kind of ID when you go to vote, in a way where there can be a financial burden to get this particular kind of ID. And sometimes these IDs are only, it's not available, but only regularly held by particular parts of the population, and thus by restricting the vote to people with those particular types of IDs, you make it automatically harder for people who either don't see the need to have those kinds of IDs or regularly don't tend to be able to afford to get them. They find that they're not able to vote. And of course, back home we have a quite laissez-faire notion of voting. So when you register to vote, you're sent a letter, and in that letter there's a kind of, I won't call it a voter ID card, it's a card with your voter registration number on it, which you can take to the polling booth, pass over to the person who gives you your voting paper, and it makes it substantially easier for them to find your name on the electoral registrar and then register that you are about to vote. But importantly, you don't need that card if you're going to vote. You can just rock up to a polling station and go, hi, my name is Runcible Spoon. I'm here to vote. And they'll go, are you on our list, Runcible? There you are, Runcible Spoon. You're not on the list. So you are on the list, please go vote. Or if you're not on the electorate list, they'll then write your name down, register that you're casting a special vote, and then your special vote will go to a separate pool to make sure you haven't special voted in other locations as well. And basically we just make it very, very easy to rock up to a polling booth and cast your vote for who you want to be the government.
Yeah, and so that kind of speaks to why these voter suppression conspiracy theories do become conspiracy theories, because you can point to an example like ours and show you don't really need particularly tight ID regulations to get to have an election that isn't full of voter fraud.
So our fraud level for a population of 4.5 million is simply in double digits, and that's low double digits. We have very, very, very little evidence of electoral fraud in our country.
And a lot of the time it will be people who are doing it to sort of make a point or something, or trying to
and in some cases it actually is a legitimate case of someone forgetting that they cast an early vote and going to the polling booth on the day and voting again.
So yes, given that voter ID laws don't appear to be necessary, it then leads one to think, well, so why would you want to have these laws, given that they just, it seems anti-democratic, surely, to make it harder for people to vote. But
there's a kind of pattern. So, and this is what gets people to the claim of conspiracy here. There is a pattern of bringing in rules, regulations, and redistricting that makes it look as if a certain subsection of the population is being targeted to make it more difficult for them to vote. And conveniently, in Republican majority states, that subsection that seems to be targeted are people who tend to vote independent or Democrat. And that's why people are very suspicious about the claim that these voter regulations are designed to stop electoral fraud, because it does look quite clearly that there is a conspiracy to suppress the vote in such a way to subvert the election outcome.
Yeah, exactly. You say, what if these voter ID laws aren't really going to have an effect on voter fraud? What are they going to have an effect on? Well, one effect is that people who can't have much more difficulty getting the required forms of ID are much less likely to vote. The people who are much less likely to have these forms of ID tend to be people. It's often sort of a lower socioeconomic status thing. Say if it's require a driver's license, well, people who can't own a car aren't going to have one of those, things like that. And so that leads people to say, so it looks like it's as I'm saying this, it's starting to sound a little more dodgy, but it's saying this is what the effect of those laws is, therefore this is what those laws are for, which we've seen in the past as kind of a slightly dodgy rhetorical move, and yet in the absence of a better idea, perhaps it does look more warranted than a voter fraud conspiracy theory.
Well, yeah, so it gets you to the intention part of conspiring, because if the people who are putting forward the claim this is all about stopping fraud are being sincere, then everything they're doing is designed to stop fraud, and the accident is it suppresses the vote. If it turns out that they're being insincere when they're talking about it being electoral fraud, and actually what they are doing is trying to suppress the vote, then it's an actual case of conspiracy. And so the question here really rests upon, do we actually trust that the people who are putting forward we're just trying to stop fraud are being sincere in their declaration about trying to stop fraud? And that, of course, is a tricky line to cross, because, of course, it will turn out that there are some people who have an unwarranted worry about election fraud and are doing their darndest to stop it with the accident of suppressing the vote. And yet it also seems there are certain people who have at least been told the data they're relying upon is bad, and yet they continue to do it, which either indicates stupidity or insincerity. And the worry is it's not stupidity, it's insincerity which explains what's going on here.
Yes, so it's all a little bit murky, but I suppose if we had good evidence either way, it wouldn't be a conspiracy theory, I suppose. Now,
well, no, if we had good evidence in one way, it would be a conspiracy
it would be a warranted,
theory. It would be a warranted
one.
conspiracy
Yes,
theory.
Yes. Now, we're starting to get a bit low on time, and we've been ragging on the US a little bit, so maybe we should look a little further afield. Matthew, could you tell me about some more interesting cases of genuine voter fraud, or at least seemingly genuine voter fraud, that has been seen around the world lately?
All right, let us go to South Korea. Because in South Korea, it turns out that the National Intelligence Service conducted an illicit campaign to influence the 2012 presidential election, mobilizing teams of experts in psychological warfare to ensure that the conservative candidate bet her liberal rival. Now, this is not contentious, because the National Intelligence Service has revealed that yes, they were engaging in that particular type of campaign, and they now accept that that's probably not what they should be doing, so they're going to refrain from doing that in future elections. So you had an agency of the government going, who do we want to be president? The Conservative or the Liberal? It's the Conservative. They'll give us more money. We're going to run a campaign to make sure that people view the Conservative candidate as being the better candidate, thus making sure that she's going to win the election. So this wasn't a case of tampering with the election by actually tampering with the results. This was a case of engaging in campaigning to ensure that people voted in a particular way.
Which, looking at this, that's one of the things that's confused me a little bit. there's your actual illegal voting. There's your, stuffing ballots and getting people to vote more than once and all that sort of business. But when it comes to dodgy things where it's just people sort of unduly trying to influence others, like, say, by hacking the DNC emails and publishing damaging information about them, it's definitely conspiratorial. Does it? What do we call that? It's not really voter fraud. And at what point does it just become campaigning? Because surely every political party is out there trying to sway your opinion to vote for them, and certainly is not shy about publishing damaging information about their opponents, or in the case of Materia Ture, simply capitalising on a damaging revelation by their opponents. So what can we say about cases like that?
Well, in most democracies, agencies that work for the government are not meant to campaign one way or the other. They're meant to remain neutral at all times. So the idea that, so it may well turn out that, say, the director of the SIS in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or the National Intelligence Service, the NIS in Korea, has political opinions and would prefer one prime minister or president over another prime minister or president. But the fact they have those political opinions doesn't mean that they should then mobilize the agency they work for to ensure that that particular candidate gets in, because they serve the government and they serve at the government's behest. They're not meant to be involved in choosing the government, and indeed that's what the NIS in Korea have admitted to, which is yeah, we probably shouldn't have done that. That's not really what we're meant to do. So it's a difference here between being a private citizen or a political party, which can campaign in one way or the other, as opposed to being part of the civil service, which is meant to be strictly neutral when it comes to these things. Members of the civil service are allowed to have political opinions, but the civil service itself should remain neutral at all times.
Right, that does make more sense. Well, what about Kenya then? I've heard a little bit about the recent Kenyan election in the news, and I understand this seems to be an interesting case where you get claims, conspiracy theories indeed, claims that an election was rigged, and yet maybe the motivation there is simply to cast doubt upon the results of an election that people don't like. Does that seem more like what's happened in Kenya?
Yeah, so the most recent election in Kenya has seen Raila Odinga, leader of Kenya's opposition party, the National Super Alliance, which has the acronym NASA, and I love that.
I do.
And he has claimed the recent election was rigged. Now, this is interesting because when it comes to elections in Africa, people, probably due to racism, are always very suspicious about what's going on with African elections. And so when Odinga made these claims that the government of the day rigged the election to ensure they would get back into power once again, people go, oh yeah, that's probably true, that's how things work in Africa, except that election observers from overseas and Western officials claimed that the election was not rigged, it was a fair and free election, and that the opposition should accept the result. And not just that, this is the fourth time Odinga has tilted at the presidency, and every other time he's lost, he's accused the government of rigging the election against him. So this actually seems not so much a warranted claim of election rigging, as it is someone who keeps on losing, using this as rhetoric to fire up his supporters to make sure he's going to be able to make another run the next time round.
Oh well, if we're talking about stereotypes of chaotic and untrustworthy nations, let's move.
And going back to my claim about El Presidente earlier in the episode,
let's move back to Latin America then. What's been going on in Venezuela?
What hasn't been going on in Venezuela? It's very confusing. So Nicolas Maduro, who took over after Chavez inconveniently died, has held a highly contentious vote to create a new legislative body that would supersede other parts of the legislature, including the opposition-led National Assembly. And this new National Constituent Assembly, the ANC, would have the power to rewrite the Constitution and is almost certain, it seems, to solidify Maduro's power, at least for the moment. So there was a vote on whether this new ANC should be created. The Venezuelan government claimed that voter turnout was about 42%, or just over 8 million people, but independent monitors and members of the opposition say actually only about 2 to 3 million people voted in total, with most of the population boycotting what they viewed to be a very rigged election.
So now we are looking at conspiracy claims around an election being rigged that do appear to be more warranted. Would that be fair to say?
So Maduro is wildly unpopular at the moment. So Chavez, who was quite popular with the people but very unpopular with the elites, Maduro actually seems to have almost reversed that. There are particular elites who quite like him because he's put them into positions of power, but the populace in general basically have turned against him. It does seem a little bit like Erdogan in Turkey. He has decided that the only way to solidify his power base is to rewrite the constitution to give him more power, and thus has created a new body to do that. But unlike Erdogan in Turkey, who is quite popular, who, even though there were claims of rigging the election there, it seems legitimate to say that a large section of the population supported Erdogan becoming the strong man of Turkey. It seems that Maduro doesn't have the support and thus had to rig the election to allow him to rewrite the constitution to solidify his claim to power.
Well, there you have it. I think we're probably out of time here. But in terms of conclusions one could draw, certainly claims of electoral fraud and claims of voter fraud and claims of voter suppression do tend to be conspiracy theories in their nature, and I guess, like we tend to see everywhere, these claims are sometimes they're warranted, sometimes they're not, and it just comes down to the context and the evidence and all of that business.
We have to evaluate these things on a case-by-case basis.
Well, there you have it. So, I guess we should do the wrapping up thing. I wrapped up a little bit too early last episode. I remember I started doing with the contact details, but then kept getting sidetracked. So, before we start doing the final formal summing up of everything, is there anything you want to say, Matthew?
The kingdom of Hyrule is quite vast, and I have yet to finish exploring it. That's all I want to say.
Right, fair enough. I saw Atomic Blonde the other week.
Any
it's
good?
Very good. It's very good. It's very conspiratorial, actually. We're just justifying my blurting that out all of a sudden. It's a spy film, so there's lots of hidden agendas and double crossing and all that sort of stuff. And I confess I am a little bit rubbish at following spy movies. I tend to just sort of go with it, and then afterwards think, hang on, how did that work? Who was that, and what were they doing? Which was how I felt afterwards. I'm not sure if it was just me being rubbish at following spy films, or if the plot of it is actually incoherent, but it doesn't really matter if the plot's incoherent, because it's just plain awesome, and has very, very well done action scenes and so on, and a spectacular soundtrack, and is just plain lots of fun.
I on film-related news, I did watch Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 last weekend. Didn't like it as much as I liked the first one. I think in part because, once again, it has a villain who just doesn't work particularly well. Marvel films do have an issue with their villains. They just don't seem to work.
Yeah, I didn't enjoy it as much as the first one, but I still thought it was a good fun romp.
Oh, it was fun. But in some level, it just felt like it was a much smaller film than the first Guardians of the Galaxy.
Yes, oh well, we'll get to get our next Guardian fix with the new Avengers film next year, or whenever that is. Now that
And
they're
I still have
actually
to watch
bringing everyone.
the last Avengers film.
The Ultron one.
Yeah.
No, I quite liked that.
I'm not
Some
really
people
into
did,
the
some
Marvel
people didn't.
films, truth be told.
Well, fair enough.
I don't feel the need to chase them.
Yeah, that's quite fair. Okay.
I'm
well,
also really not into the DC films either. Superhero films actually don't really interest me, truth be told. But I am looking forward to Kingsman 2. That's a film I want to see on the big screen.
That does look like fun. But now I feel we're being slightly gratuitous in our pop culture ramblings, so maybe I should just draw a line in the sand and cut us both off and say you've been listening to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, featuring me, Josh Addison. I am based primarily in Auckland, New Zealand. In fact, almost totally. I'm not nearly as well travelled as Matthew is. I've been out of the country, I can't remember how many times, but I could probably count on one hand. But that's where I am. If you want to get in touch with me, you could do so on Twitter, where I go by the name Monkey Fluids, for reasons we have gone into in the past, and I don't really feel the need to again. Matthew, on the other hand, he's just an international gadfly. He's in Romania now, but next week, who knows? It's Romania again, I think, isn't it? But a few weeks after that,
basically.
but not long, not many weeks after that, he'll be back here in New Zealand.
After a short stint in London.
And then, quite frankly, who knows? The sky's the limit. Because that's
Is it though, Joshua? Is the sky the limit?
Well, I think it is for you, because you fly in passenger aeroplanes. If you were getting to Romania in a rocket or something, then no, the sky would not be the limit. But I think, as it happens, your preferred mode of transport is limited to the sky and no higher than that.
But see, I'm waiting for the railgun that transports you from one country to another. I can't wait for that.
That will be fun, but until that time... No, so if you wanted to get in touch with Matthew, if we wanted to get in touch with you, how might one do so?
Well, you can find me as Conspiracism on Twitter, and you can also go to my website, episto.org, which I managed to shut down almost completely with a balked WordPress update just early this week, but everything's fine, everything is back up and running. Do not trust automated updates. Sometimes they fail and your blog completely disappears and you have to FTP into it and delete files. No fun at all.
Yes, no, I did notice that when you put a link up, and then I followed the link and just got a bunch of server errors, but I figured, well, that Matthew, he's a smart boy, he must have realised something's gone wrong and he'll fix it, and you did. So
I did.
So this podcast itself, you can find it where it's hosted on Podbean at conspiracism.podbean.com, but I'm pretty sure we're on most of the popular platforms where the cool kids hang out. We're on iTunes, we're on Stitcher, we're on a bunch of other ones, I don't know. What else are we on? You've signed us up to various other little aggregations.
I've signed us up to so many things I can't even remember what they are.
But yes, and of course, I suppose I keep forgetting to mention that we're also on YouTube as well. We're webcamming ourselves as we speak on this here Skype call, and I'll be sticking a video of this podcast up on my YouTube channel where my username is Monkey Fluids again, although you'd probably be better off just searching YouTube for Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. You'll find them all there. If you feel like watching our faces as the words come out of our mouth holes, instead of just listening to us in your ear holes. It's all about holes, really, in the end, I think. It's probably a good...
And all holes. All holes.
All holes, all the time. I thought we were going to... Okay, we've had a little round of chicken challenge recently where someone will say something like that and then it'll be who gets to say just like your mum. But we both held off. Maybe we were both trying to be the better man, but really we're both the worst man, I think. So I think we've done all the usual bizzo. So the only thing left to do is go out on a song. We've got a song called Vote, because you should, always, at every possible opportunity. New Zealanders will get the chance to in just over a month. And I heartily recommend that they do. It's by Save Slaves. And that's really all that can be said about that song. So as we're taken out by the strains of Vote by Save Slaves, just remains for me to say goodbye, and for Matthew to say...
farewell.
We've taken a
You've been listening to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, starring Josh Addison and Matthew R. Extentive, and produced by Matthew R. Extentive. If you've enjoyed the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, why not contribute to our Patreon or Podbean patron page? And you can contact us on podcastconspiracy@gmail.com. That's podcastconspiracy@gmail.com.